Hello and welcome to Commsverse. This session is called How to Avoid the Microsoft Teams Islands Mode Trap, and today will be presented to you by Johan Delimon. Johan, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, let's talk about how to upgrade from Skype for Business to Teams and don't get stuck in the island mode trap. I specifically created this session because I have so many customers who run into the same issues. And for some reason or another, island mode seems to be either the easiest way to go to Teams or the quickest way, or maybe advised by some people. But from my point of view, it doesn't have the proper planning, and there are some real issues with this because some of the ways you work with Teams and Skype, there's some interconnectivity issues, and people don't actually understand what's going on there. So this session specifically targets why you shouldn't use island mode, because that's not the preferred way to do it, from my point of view anyway. So let's first give a big thanks to all the sponsors to make this happen, right? And a little word about myself. I'm Johan Delimon. I live in Belgium. I also work a lot in Belgium. I work internationally too. My main job is working Microsoft UC products, Skype for Business, but now mainly Teams, of course. I got lucky to be renewed for a 12th time as MVP, so pretty happy about that. I work at The Collective as I'm a managing partner there, and we focus on Microsoft 365. So let's look at the agenda. So first of all, I do want to make you understand that Skype for Business is still important for Microsoft Teams, although it's not always obvious, right? Why does Microsoft Teams need to use Skype for Business, and how does Skype for Business needs to be configured in that way? And then I'll first dive into side-by-side capabilities between Skype and Teams, and Microsoft calls it overlapping capabilities, but essentially it's island mode. And then after that, we will dive into the proper way of upgrading from Skype to Teams by using upgrade modes, and then I'll explain how to actually do that. So let's first look at Skype for Business Online underpinnings for Teams. It does say online, Skype for Business Online, but we also need Skype for Business On-Prem in certain scenarios. Certainly, if you have a hybrid deployment, then Skype for Business On-Prem also comes into play. So, but first of all, let's look at the high-level architecture, right? We have Skype for Business on one side, we have Teams on the other side. Of course, Teams is a cloud-only product. It doesn't have any on-prem components. It doesn't exist. Although some customers ask me, can you deploy Teams for me? And I want to deploy it on my premises. Well, that's not possible, of course. There's so much more in Teams than you could possibly deploy yourself, right? It's an integrated part of Office 365. You cannot just deploy it on your premises. So on the other hand, you have Skype for Business, and of course there is on-premises, and you have the cloud, and we have a hybrid environment there where Skype for Business On-Prem talks to Skype for Business Online. But then, if you look at this from another perspective, we have the on-prem components, which is Skype for Business Server, right? We don't have any Teams components on-prem. And then we have cloud components, where it's going to be Skype for Business Online and Microsoft Teams. And you can either use Skype for Business and either use Teams, or you can use them together. But cloud versus on-premise, and how do we talk between on-premise and the cloud? We need to have a hybrid setup there. So this session is maybe a little bit more targeted for people that are using Skype for Business On-Prem with enterprise voice investments, and there's still a lot out there. Not necessarily only for cloud-only customers, although this session is also very valuable for those customers as well. But essentially, it is the hybrid setup is required to have a good interop between Skype for Business and the Teams platform. Now, if you actually look how this interop essentially works, is that there is a Skype to Teams gateway. Because Skype for Business Online does talk to Teams, but it requires a special gateway because all the signaling coming from Skype to Teams, it's not the same signaling type. We're going from SIP to more like web-based protocols. So if a Teams user wants to call a Skype Online user, in this case, Teams user is going to call Microsoft Teams, and Teams is going to do through the Interop gateway to Skype for Business Online, and then we're going to connect to this Skype Online user. And then we'll have both-way conversations. Now, of course, the same thing happens when the Skype user happens to be in the on-premises environment, then the same thing essentially happens. But Teams is not going to talk directly to Skype for Business on-prem server. No, it needs to talk to Skype for Business Online first, and then goes over the hybrid connection to Skype for Business on-premise, and then connects to the Skype on-prem user. So essentially, the hybrid part is really important here. Now, what is also important and not always very visible is that you essentially need a Skype for Business shadow account when you're a Teams-only user. So if you want to use Teams and fully use Teams, you need to have your Skype for Business account to be hosted in online, even if you have a hybrid deployment and an on-prem server deployment as well. So this account is really crucial, but because it enables some functionality within Teams. So essentially, those go in pair. Like if you are a Teams-only user, your Skype for Business online instance needs to be online, and it requires to be there. Like, for example, if you would say, this is a Teams-only user, and I remove the Skype license from that user, you're taking away functionality, right? Sounds a bit weird, but that's the case. So you need to have that Skype for Business Online license. It needs to be in Skype for Business Online, and it's used by Teams functionality. Underlying functionality is being used. So essentially, when do you need this account, right? Everything this has to do with PSTN calling, Microsoft phone system. Also, when you want to use direct routing, so numbers from Microsoft, but also for direct routing, you need this Skype for Business Online instance in place. When we're doing federation, whether it's with Skype or whether it's with Teams, you do need this object there, as well for presence and for interop with Skype and Teams. So you see there is a lot of reasons why we still need this Skype for Business object there, and it's really important for us to understand what are all the metrics going back and forth here. Now, the same thing happens when, so this is a calling example. So Teams user going to call Skype for Business Online user in this case. So of course, we're going to Teams, the interop gateway comes into play. Essentially, Skype for Business Online uses this shadow object and connects to Skype for Business Online user. So essentially, the signaling goes from Teams to Skype, but it uses the Skype for Business Online infrastructure. But then, of course, the media flows directly between the endpoints, so most likely it's going direct between those endpoints, depending on the network, of course. And you see the Teams gateway in use here. So it's the MS Link Skype Gateway Teams is being used. It's probably an earlier version, but you see, you can all find this in the SIP logs when you use the snooper tool for Skype for Business. Now, if we add Skype for Business on-prem to the mix, essentially the same thing happens, but of course we go over the hybrid, and now the signaling path goes all the way from Skype for Business on-prem to Skype for Business Online and then to Microsoft Teams. Now, it is important that Skype for Business Online has the interop gateway to Teams, but Skype for Business on-prem doesn't know anything about this interop gateway. it only knows about Skype for Business Online. So that is why this shadow object is so important, because if we call from this Skype user to this Teams user, essentially from the Skype for Business on-prem perspective, we're actually just calling the Skype for Business Online user. And of course, Skype for Business Online will in the back make sure that the call is routed correctly to the Teams endpoint instead of the Skype endpoint. But you see here, the interop between Skype for Business on-prem and Skype for and the Teams is through the Skype for Business Online. And then the media will flow most likely between the endpoints directly. So this is all crucial for you to understand before we talk about all the upgrade modes, because Skype for Business is still important here. So let's look at the upgrade modes. And the first one I'm going to talk about is essentially not really an upgrade mode. It's just an enable mode, I would say. It's island mode, right? And if this would be an interactive audience, I would ask the audience, like, how many of you are in island mode? And I would probably see a lot of hands. And then for the people that didn't raise their hands, I would say, like, okay, for those that didn't say anything, maybe you don't know that you're in island mode. And most likely that's going to be a large piece of the people that didn't raise their hands. Because in reality, I see so many companies use island mode and not what I will talk about in a minute. So essentially, island mode, side-by-side overlapping capabilities. It sounds fun, right? Island mode. It sounds like vacation, like nice beach, clean water, like you're laying in a chair and having cocktails. But essentially, it's not the case. And I would call it the shark mode because it will bite you. Island mode will bite you because people are not prepared, and you can do as much communication as you like, but still, using island mode and having Skype for Business being used at the same time causes confusion all the time. So essentially, what does island mode have, or what do we consider being island mode? Island mode is the default upgrade mode set by Microsoft, and that's a big deal because this is one of the biggest reasons why probably most companies just use island mode, because you just switch on Teams, island mode is the default, and you say, okay, we're able to use Teams. Wow. But then you didn't think about all the scenarios there because you're breaking some of those. So while island mode isn't all that bad for Interop, it's really horrible, but it does allow for rapid pilot programs and organic adoption within the organization. I can't argue with that. That's totally true. And it's really fast how you can do that. But it's an unmanaged approach. So essentially, you didn't do any planning, like how do we migrate from Skype for Business to Teams? No, let's just enable Teams and let's just like have people work with it, and it will automatically be okay and people will get used to it. But they will run into issues. So it's essentially no admin effort because it's just enabling Teams. Now, on the other hand, it is kind of a blocker for upgrading to full Teams mode because sometimes you cannot move away from island mode because you didn't do any planning. And then if you say this user is going to be Teams only, maybe it's losing his enterprise voice capabilities. No, you have to do proper planning in order to get the enterprise voice components over there as well. So sometimes it's just a blocker as well, which is not really good. Essentially, island mode doesn't give the user the full team capabilities, and this is also not really known because it seems that you can do everything, but then you run into issues and then like, okay, something's going on here. So it doesn't give you all the functionality. And essentially, this is even worse because you put the responsibility of communicating with the rest of the organization in the hands of the users. Like, they need to understand what client do I need to use to connect to a certain person. Like, how bad is that? Like, giving people choices is bad for help desk calls, I would say, like bad for user acceptance. Because island mode, usually it's delivered in proof of concept, in pilot programs, but then it doesn't take into account all the other people. What about the rest of the organization? Like, and then people in island modes need to understand how I'm going to communicate with the rest of the world. I cannot just use Teams because I'm using both clients. So the worst thing essentially is there's no interop between Skype and Teams, right? So you have to use the right client. Now, this is the comprehensive chart that says, like, this is the interop matrix for Skype and Teams in island mode, right? So we have the sender and the recipient, both in island mode. Well, it's pretty easy. It's Skype talking to Skype and Teams talking to Teams. There is no other combination. So it's really, really islands, and there is no integration, right? Side by side, use both clients. Now, there are some issues, of course. This is probably not the full list, but there are a lot of issues coming from this island mode. So essentially, they don't work together, right? That's something we already know. And it allows only Teams to talk to Teams and Skype to Skype, right? So we need to have both clients running at the same time. And you need to have both clients running all the time. So people will get messages in Teams, people will get messages in Skype, people will send messages in Skype, will send messages in Teams, and maybe sending them in Teams won't always work. So essentially, the user needs to switch between those clients. Me as an end user, I don't like to switch clients. I just want to use one client and do everything in there. Also, presence is not shared between the platforms. So if you use island mode, of course, you have your presence in Skype, you have your presence in Teams. If you're in a meeting in Teams, you get a call in Skype. Well, this call is going through, right? Like, people see your presence in Skype, they say you're available, so they will call you. But essentially, you're in a meeting, but people don't know. So that can really happen. Now, do not disturb presence state is ignored because there's no sharing of the presence, right? And then the user has to know if the target user is using Teams or not. Because essentially, if you're sending a message, if you're sending a call, the recipient decides what is going to happen, right? So if he doesn't have Teams, you're going to run into some weird issues, and I'll show you some screenshots about that. And so essentially, it's generating missed chat and missed call notifications in the inbox. It's going to voicemail when you're trying to call from island mode to a Skype-only user. And then in some other locations, I've seen that people are sending out meeting invites, and then people have the choice whether to use a Skype meeting or a Teams meeting. But what meeting are you essentially going to use? Like, does the user really need to decide? And I've actually seen users press the Skype online meeting button and included the Teams meeting button and have two meeting links, two meeting join links in one invite. I've seen that happen, right? What meeting do you join, Skype one or the Teams one? And if you join one or the other, well, it's two separate meetings. You're in separate meetings, so that's really weird. And then all the federated and the PSTN communication always end up in Skype for Business, even though you want to use Teams, right? It's really confusing. And that's the way the island mode works. So I kind of tried to make a testing matrix. And the real problem here is that we have Skype users which are in Skype mode, but I didn't really talk about modes yet. So essentially I have to talk about island mode and island mode. So I have island mode. So the default configuration for everyone is island mode. But if you don't have a Teams license, right, you don't have the Teams client, you cannot use it. But the Teams user in island mode sending you a message doesn't know that. So essentially, if we are in this scenario where the sender is in island mode, he has a Teams license, and he also uses Skype for Business because in island mode, he sends to a Skype for Business user that doesn't have a Teams license. Well, this is where the biggest issues are, right? So the island mode users that don't have a Teams license. So what is typically the case? We are going to do a pilot, and the pilot group is going to have a Teams license, but all the others are not going to have Teams, right? They don't have a Teams license. So this is really confusing, right? Because offline presence, missed chats, missed calls, and so on, right? So let's look at what essentially happens here. And I'm specifically looking at the island-to-island mode with Teams license, without Teams license, because this is where the biggest problems are. But I'm not saying island mode doesn't have any other issues apart from this, but these are really, really bad. So essentially offline presence, but okay, maybe we can still live with that. Unanswered chats, like if someone sends a chat to a Skype for Business user that doesn't have Teams, well, Teams doesn't know that, and the chat stays open there. You send a message and it stays there, and you don't get a response from a user, and you're like, what's happening? Same thing for calls, they go to voicemail, and then on the other side, we see missed notifications for email and for missed chats, and we get voicemails. So I have some screenshots around this, and in this case, this is a Teams user in island mode sending a message to a Skype user that doesn't have a Teams license, but he's still configured in island mode, right? Because this is a setting. So first of all, we are not seeing anything special here. Like normally when someone is in a Skype mode, you should see this person is using Skype for Business, right? It doesn't say that. So the island mode doesn't have any clue, like, is this a real user or not? Like, even though it doesn't have a license, it does look like a real user. Although its presence is offline, but we can send a message. So you see the presence is offline, but I was able to send this message. So what happens on the other side, and you see I have a text which is a little bit longer than just saying hi. So what the receiving side, they get a message saying, hey, someone is trying to connect to you on Teams. So, and there is like a part of the message is in here, but you don't see the full message, right? Of course, you do want to see the full message, but because this user is sending something to me, I should better go look. So what do? You say go to conversation. Now, when you do this, you end up nowhere. You're kind of blocked from everything because you don't have a Teams license. Essentially, this site says, well, you should ask your admin to enable Microsoft Teams. So, but all you wanted to do was check this message, and you're not even receiving the message. So really confusing, wouldn't you think? So this is kind of really bad practice. Now the same thing happens for if we want to call from this island mode Teams user, and you see we're trying to reach the other person, and it says forwarding to voicemail. Luckily, we have Cloud Voicemail, which records the message and sends the message to the user's mailbox, and we can still listen to the voicemail. Of course, if I want to call back to this user, I would have to use Skype, right? But it's a weird experience. So I included this slide because it essentially comes from Microsoft when they were migrating to Teams or upgrading to Teams. Essentially, the important part is on the left here, where they say, if you want to connect from Teams to Skype, Teams chats will go to Teams only, right? This is what we also saw. And at the time that Microsoft did the upgrade modes really didn't work correctly or were not introduced yet. So they had to use island mode, which gave some issues, but this is also what I see with other customers. So Teams chats go lost. And of course, if you want to call from Skype, from Teams to Skype, it doesn't work because you go to voicemail, and some sort of a workaround would be dial the PSTN number, which is really weird because then you have to know the PSTN number or go look for it. The things on the right, they are more like Interop stories, and they are still valid today, but they're more targeted around the Interop story. And I'm going to skip those for now. So essentially, we run into the island mode dilemma. So either if you want to use island mode, and I still strongly suggest you don't, but if you want to use island mode, make sure you enable all users because you run into some serious issues there. So no single user without any Teams license. So otherwise you will get missed communications. But I still think island mode is, from adoption point, upgrade mode, interop, satisfaction is kind of a nightmare. I see this all the time. So really think about, do I really want to use island mode? Is that the proper way to use Teams and do pilots? Because we also have a proper way to do this, right? We have upgrade modes. Upgrade modes is also side by side, which means you can run Skype and Teams together, but it's select capabilities. It means you can only do a certain way or a certain communication stream from one client. If you want to do chat, you have to use Skype, for example. If you do calling, you have to use Skype. If you use Teams only, then you do everything in Teams. But we'll dive into this. So essentially, this comes from the Microsoft website. How do you upgrade to Microsoft Teams? And essentially, they say get started, right? But use chat, Teams, channel, and apps, which is more the collaboration side of Teams, which makes a lot of sense because you're adding functionality on top of Skype because Skype doesn't have those capabilities. And then in the next stage, you say, let's do meetings and conferencing. Let's move over the meetings to Teams. And then lastly, move over the voice components. This is a really more streamlined approach to moving to Teams, and it's a proper way of doing it. So we do have the upgrade modes, and this is the full list of upgrade modes. So it's not a really long list. And the first one, island mode, I wouldn't really call it an upgrade mode because it's a side-by-side mode. It's nothing to do with upgrading. It's just enabling. So I would essentially remove island mode because it's not really appropriate. So what else do we have then? We have Skype for Business only, Skype for Business with Teams collaboration, Skype for Business with Teams collaboration meetings. So you see Skype for Business 3 times. That means we have 3 Skype for Business modes. We just have 1 Teams mode, which is Teams only, right? Teams only will probably be the destination, and everything will be done in Teams, no longer in Skype. But we have the capability of configuring users separately, like some can be in Teams only, some can be in Skype modes, and whatever mode you choose here, you can decide what users are going to be in there. So the upgrade modes are really important because they help you manage the upgrade from Skype for Business to Teams. So you are going to block functionality that's not ready yet and make sure that you prepare your environment to move to Teams only in a better way, right? So it's a controlled upgrade because you control it from the admin side. Just enabling Teams in island mode doesn't control anything, right? It's just enabling. So the advantage of upgrade modes is that you can move certain user groups or users or locations, whatever you want to group your users. You can say this group of users is going to be in this certain mode, right? So you have the distinction between different user groups being in different modes. Now, the important thing here is if you use the upgrade modes, users do not need to choose what client they use to communicate, because it will be visible. If they are in the proper mode, they know they only have one client where they can do chat, calling, and meetings. It won't be confusing because there's only one client that can do those capabilities. Now, it allows you to gradually move more and more users. Like, of course, if we're going to start with a pilot, you want to gradually move more and more users. But of course, you don't want to do that all at the same time. Now, and this is especially important if you have an on-prem deployment, a large on-prem deployment, enterprise voice, you have to use upgrade modes because it's going to be a nightmare if you don't. And then the upgrade modes, the other advantage is that you enable Skype and Teams to talk to each other, right? So the Teams only users and the Skype users will be able to communicate directly. So Teams will be able to talk to Skype and vice versa. So looking at what are all the capabilities here on the different coexistence modes or upgrade modes. So essentially we have the islands one, which is the confusing one, right? So we should change the name of island mode in confusing mode because you have chat, calling, and meetings in Skype. You have chat, calling, and meetings in Teams, right? And of course, there are some of those scenarios where we really have real issues. So you don't want to use that. Then we have 3 Skype modes. So the first one is on the bottom, and then the upper 2. So Skype for Business only has no Teams. So potentially we don't have any Teams license, and the Teams cannot be used by these users. Now, good examples are, for example, enterprise voice users or users that cannot use Teams because they're not validated to have cloud communication or compliance and control, or whatever reason there is. There's so many valid reasons to use only Skype for Business. Also like VDI, for example, like is everything ready on our VDI platform to do Teams? So potentially some of the users will be in Skype for Business only. Now, probably the easiest way to start with is Skype for Business with Teams collaboration, because we're doing chat, calling, and meeting in Skype and adding the collaboration part of Teams, right? So we're adding Teams so people get used to Teams in an easier way, but are not confused by starting to call in Teams and not getting anywhere on the Skype side. And then the next step up would be you add meetings to Teams as well. So instead of doing meetings in Skype, they move over to Teams. So essentially, this is also adding more and more capabilities to Teams, because now suddenly we're doing meetings in Teams. And of course, the meetings in Teams are better than in Skype. There's no way to ignore that. That's an important point. But it helps you to still have those enterprise voice capabilities in those larger environments. And then Teams only is, of course, the end state, where we have chat, calling, and meetings and collaboration all in Teams. So we're no longer using Skype, where we have moved completely to Teams. So if we look at Teams only, essentially you want to be in Teams only, right? You don't want to be an island. If you want to use Teams, you should be in Teams only, because it's the full experience for the users. You have fully transitioned from Skype for Business to Teams. You gain Skype for Business Interop along the way. You gain federation capabilities in Teams, like your federation chats and calls will go into Teams instead of Skype for Business, you get PSTN capabilities and PSTN audio conferencing. So you get actually more if you leave island mode as fast as possible. So this is the full interop matrix between the Skype modes and the Teams modes. So if you are in Teams only, you send to Teams only, of course, Teams to Teams is going to work. If you're in Teams only and you're sending to Skype mode, this Teams user is going to talk to the Skype user, so it just works. We have interop between those two. Same way it goes for Skype to Teams, it just works. So there's no confusion, and clients can talk to clients and users can talk to users. Now, the important one is if you're using Teams only, your Skype account must be homed in online. So that's a really important distinction here. So being aware of time, I'm just going to highlight the important pieces here. So this is like coming from Microsoft, so Microsoft recommendations. They say you can use island mode or use more the Skype modes, but it kind of depends on your user environment. If you're a pure online customer and you are really sure user can handle 2 clients, right, and all the quirks that come with that, you may be able to use island mode, right? And then hopefully you're not too long in that state. But then if you have a complex large environment, mainly on-prem customers, but also for online customers, right? Because it doesn't fit everyone all the time. When you have third-party integrations, you probably have to use the Skype upgrade modes in order to move to Teams, right? Because you probably need more time and need more preparation. So this is essentially how it looks. If we come from the Skype for Business with Teams collaboration, I'm not talking about Skype only mode here. I'm talking about Skype for Business with Teams collaboration. So presence chat, calling, meetings, PSTN in Skype, and just the collaboration part in Teams. So in Outlook, we still create the Skype meetings. And if you look at the Teams client, you don't see all the applications here. It just has Teams. It doesn't have the chat tab. It doesn't have the calling tab. It shouldn't have the calendar tab either, I think. So the Teams client essentially doesn't have all the features. If you then go to enable meetings in Teams, so the meetings move over to Teams, essentially your Teams client looks more or less the same. You do have the calendar here, and you can enable Teams meetings from Outlook client, right? It's being replaced from the Skype icon to Teams icon in Outlook. And then if we move over completely to Teams, your Skype client is going to say like, well, our organization is now using Teams, so go to Teams, and then you see the chat and the calling buttons appear, and you will see the presence as well. So essentially your Skype client is being locked down and it's there. It's still on your PC and you still need it. And if you're joining Skype meetings, it will be your Skype client starting up. So this is essentially the same image as Teams only. So this is the full picture, and you see the larger image here. So if you kind of use the proper upgrade modes, but this user is in island mode talking to a real Skype user and with the right mode configured, right? In that scenario, you see this originating user in Teams island mode talking to a Skype user that doesn't have Teams. Of course, that is not possible. And the interface actually tells you, message Skype for Business user on Skype for Business, right? There is no way to send a message here. There's no way to initiate a call. So it's important to understand it's always the receiving side who decides how the messages and the calls are going to be routed. And in this case, Teams does know because the receiving party is a Skype user. So he has to use Skype to connect to that user. So that's less confusing, right? So now I'm in Teams only mode. I'm actually using my account here, connecting to an other user that's in Skype for Business mode. So when you want to do federation, you just search for a user and you say search externally. You click and it says, okay, this is an external user, and you see the Skype icon here. It knows it's a Skype user at a different organization. But I can start a message here. I can do video call, I can do audio call, I can even do desktop sharing, although there's some quirks to that. So we're sending the message back and forth, and that just works. We can do audio calling, it just works. So from the Skype side, you see this. So we're just chatting with this user. And then at this stage, we have done the call. I didn't put a screenshot here, so it just works in both ways, Skype to Teams, whether it's federation or whether it's interop between a Skype user and a Teams user. It works the same way. Now, the only thing is when we're adding desktop sharing, we cannot do desktop sharing between a Teams client and a Skype client. It will start a meeting, because if you click this, it will say start meeting, and you will actually go to the meeting, and then the Skype user will have to join this meeting through the web client. And I'll have some screenshots with that. So this user is in the lobby, we have to admit him, and then we have this meeting going on. So from the Skype client, essentially you get the meeting link in here, right? So you get the meeting link in the IM conversation, you click it, and of course you don't have the Teams app because you don't have a license. You have to continue in the browser. You have to type your name because you don't have a Teams license. It doesn't recognize you, so you have to type your name, and it recognizes you as a guest, and you log into the meeting as a guest. So essentially, it's a little bit of workaround, but still, it's far better than having the user being confused. So how do we apply these upgrade modes? So there are two ways to configure it, because there's one side is the org-wide settings, which means everyone gets the upgrade mode, unless a specific user has a specific setting, right? So Teams upgrade mode by default is island mode. At my customers, I immediately changed that because I don't want any new users to get into island mode and get lost, right? So I do want to configure this. For example, it's Skype for Business with Teams collaboration. But then you can go to a user, and when you select the Teams upgrade properties on a user, you get into this window, which you can select either the org-wide settings, which means pick whatever we put on the org-wide configuration, or I want to specifically choose a setting, the upgrade mode here, which you can do per user, right? Of course, if you have 1,000 users, you're going to script this with PowerShell. You're not going to do this one by one. I'm going to skip this slide because of timing restrictions. But then I want to talk about Teams upgrade planning, because if we're in a pilot, we do want to plan to have a better Teams integration here. So the thing is, we don't want to take away functionality from a pilot group, and we want to add the missing functionality that island mode doesn't have. And we do want to enable the interop because we do want them to talk to the other users, right? So essentially, I would say do a project, move away from island mode. That's my intention here. So we don't want to use the two clients. So let's do away with island mode. So what options do we have? Either you move to Teams only, or either you move to Skype mode, either with collab meetings or Skype only, but move away from island mode. Just make sure that you have prepared everything for those users that can go to Teams only. Why don't you go to Teams only? Island mode doesn't give you all the functionality. Now, I do want to stress one thing, because this was something I ran into with a customer. Org-wide settings for coexistence upgrade modes also dictate what guests can do, which is really confusing. So it's one setting for two features. I think this is a really bad thing that Microsoft did, and they still haven't fixed it. So I would say maybe at the organizational level, we have to use Teams only, because if you say Skype for Business in the org-wide setting, the guest user cannot chat, cannot do calling. If you do Teams only, then the guest user can do calling, but then of course you have to apply the proper upgrade modes to all users that are not in Teams only, right? So it's the reverse. So luckily Microsoft has new documentation around how do you assign policies to individual users, a batch of users, or a group to a group essentially. And there's the Microsoft documentation that can help you there. And I'm almost finished. I wrote a blog post about this like 1 year ago, like don't get stuck in island mode trap, which is more or less what I'm presenting in this session. But still, it's still relevant because I run into issues, the same issues with customers every single day. And I think it's just too difficult for people to understand what are the upgrade modes and why is island not a good idea. So let me leave you with some adoption resources. This is a generic slide. You probably have seen that before, but I put it in the deck because upgrading from Skype to Teams is not only a technical part, it requires a lot of adoption too. And then let's finish with this slide. If you want to give feedback, which is really important. And then I will jump into a call in a few minutes for the post-session breakout, so you can ask all your questions. Maybe we can have, I do see there's in the Q&A some questions. So not sure, Peter, if I didn't read any of them, are there important questions in there?
Yeah, Johan, we do have some questions from our audience. So if okay with you, we'll quickly go through them. I'll read them out to you, and you can respond if that's cool before jumping into the breakout session.
Yeah, it's fine.
Fantastic. Let's go for it. So the first one is from Venkat, and Venkat is asking us, can we get PowerPoint slides of this session? Great information. So.
I don't know about the logistics. I would think they will be distributed after, but I'm not really sure how it will be managed. But I guess yes. If not, I hope you saw my connection details. Maybe I'll go to that slide in the beginning. So yeah, ask me the next question.
Okay, let's go for it. This is actually this is from Anonymous. Not really a question as such, but if I remember correctly, a user with a Teams license that has never logged into Teams is also treated like a user without a license. Is that a fair statement, Johan? No.
Well, it will have the same result.
Okay.
And also, if your Teams client is not running, it will have the same result. But essentially, you will be able to click the link of the miscommunication and go to the actual communication, right? The fact that you don't have a license, you cannot even see the message. If you have a license, you can still get to the message because then you actually start up Teams. So that's the difference. Okay.
Fantastic. And we have another anonymous question here. This is quite a long one, so I'll try and get through it as quickly as we can. It's been interesting to hear Johan's thoughts on this and agree it's weird experience, but much of this in islands mode can easily be managed with change management and comms to the organization. Generally is a faster move to Teams. This said, anyone who disagrees with the advice of Brian Nice is brave in my opinion.
Well, there are multiple strategies, and I agree. It's always a discussion. And while island mode can be faster, it depends what organization you are, right? Because, like I said, if you need to talk about compliance, VDI, I don't know, Teams is available for VDI, but there's still lots of functionality missing there. But it is a debate, right? Do you want to focus on the user's experience, or do you want to focus on getting Teams as fast as you can, right? They're two different things. And I'm more like a technical guy, and I don't like to confuse users. And I understand that if you have proper adoption, it may be possible. But remember the slide where Microsoft says you can use island mode if you make sure that all your users are capable of running the two clients and understand all the capabilities. But I don't think it's a good idea. That's my personal opinion. So, but I had many discussions with customers, and in the long run, they understand that island mode is probably not the best approach. But sometimes customers are too far in the journey and have issues reverting that. But then my point is that go away from island mode as fast as you can and go to Teams only and Skype modes for the users that can't, right? That's my advice.
Okay, great. Excuse me. Then we have a really nice message from Oliver, who's just saying, great session, Johan. Thank you for that. Then we have a couple more to get through. Anonymous is asking, isn't the default configuration now Teams only for new tenants?
Yeah, right. That's correct. But of course, tenants that exist for more than, I don't know, is it 6 months, 1 year? I don't even know the time frame when it switched. But you're right, the new tenants don't have this issue. But if you're a big customer, most likely you're going to be stuck in this island mode configuration because the tenant existed for a longer time. But yeah, new tenants don't have the Teams only mode, don't have the island mode configuration.
Okay, and then just a couple more before we jump off onto the breakout session. Really nice message from Sergio here. Amazing session, Johan. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and real life experience. And then the final comment is, final question here. After migration from Skype for Business Island mode to Teams only, does the user lose the contact list or other settings that will override after the migration?
Well, the contact list is migrated as part of the upgrade to Teams only. So then essentially there's a last sync and it gets carried over from Skype for Business. Your meetings most likely are going to be rescheduled because there's the meeting update, as it's called, backend service. I forgot the exact name, but there's a process that goes through your Exchange mailbox and updates all the meetings. But the requirement is that you have Exchange Online there. So it depends where your mailbox is hosted. Does it override any settings? Yeah, probably if you have forwarding configured or delegates or team calls. Yeah, you probably have to do it again.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Johan. So that's all the questions, and we've reached the end of the session. We've run out of time. So if you would like to talk some more with Johan following this session, you can have the chance to do that in the session breakout area. So please check your Q&A, which I've just posted the link for you to join that meeting. And thank you very much for your time, Johan, and thank you all for watching.
Right, I'll jump into the post-session meeting.
Thank you all, and goodbye.